No, no, please, not this. Mr. Howard's cry ripped through the house, followed by the harsh, unmistakable sound of something smashing against the floor. Annie jolted where she stood. The sponge slipped from her small hand and fell into the sink. She didn't stop to look at it. She ran. Her feet moved faster than her thoughts, carrying her down the hallway toward the living room. The sound still rang in her ears, sharp and wrong. The kind of sound that made grown-ups forget how to breathe. Annie had heard it before, late at night, when her mother thought she was asleep. She knew what it meant. She reached the doorway and froze. The radio lay on the floor. It rested on its side, silent. Its wooden frame split at one corner. A thin wire trailed out from the back like something torn loose. Mr. Howard was crouched beside it, unsteady, one hand gripping the chair for support, the other trembling inches above the radio, as if he were afraid to touch it again. "I didn't see it," he whispered. "I stood up too fast." His legs gave way. Annie rushed forward without thinking. She wrapped her arms around his waist and leaned back with all her weight, just as she had done so many times with her mother. Mr. Howard startled at the contact, then sagged against her, breath shaking. Together they managed to lower him back into the chair. "Sit," Annie said quietly. She waited until he was steady, until his breathing slowed and his hands stopped shaking. Only then did she turn back to the radio. She knelt and lifted it carefully, holding it close to her chest. She examined the cracked corner, the loose wire, the bent edge of the back panel. She turned the knob once. Nothing, not even static. The silence felt heavier than the crash. Mr. Howard covered his face with both hands. His shoulders trembled as tears slipped through his fingers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He just cried, the way people cried when something precious was taken from them without warning. "That radio," he said hoarsely, lowering his hands. "My wife listened to it every morning. Same station, same time." His eyes were red and unfocused. "After she died, I kept it on. It felt like she was still here." Annie swallowed. She held the radio a little tighter. "I can fix it," she said. Mr. Howard looked up sharply. "No." He shook his head at once, slow but firm. "No. Please don't. You'll only make it worse." Annie stepped closer. "I know how," she said. "I promise." "You're too young," he replied, panic edging his voice. "It's old. It's delicate. If it breaks for good..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He just shook his head again. Annie didn't argue. She simply met his eyes. "I can fix it," she said again, more firmly this time. "I've done it before." There was something in her voice that made him pause. Not stubbornness, not pride, certainty, the kind that didn't ask for permission. Mr. Howard looked from Annie to the radio and back again. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. "You don't understand," he whispered. "That radio is the last thing that still sounds like her." Annie nodded. "That's why I won't break it." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Mr. Howard exhaled, long and shaky. "All right," he said quietly. "But if it starts to get worse, you stop." Annie nodded once. "Okay. Two effort tense." She set the radio carefully on the table and ran down the hallway. She returned moments later with her small canvas tool bag, worn at the edges, the zipper slightly crooked. She placed it beside the radio and climbed onto the chair, her movements calm and deliberate. Mr. Howard watched, barely blinking. Annie opened the back panel and peered inside. The problem revealed itself almost immediately. A wire had come loose, a connection bent out of place. Nothing shattered, nothing gone forever. She worked slowly, her fingers steady, blocking out everything else. The house fell quiet again, but this time the silence was filled with purpose. The faint click of a screw, the soft scrape of metal. Annie leaned closer, listening not with her ears, but with her hands. Time passed. Mr. Howard sat rigid in his chair, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Every sound Annie made felt like a test he wasn't sure he could endure. Finally, she tightened the last screw and sat back. She wiped her palms on her sweater and reached for the knob. She paused, then she turned it. At first, there was only static. Mr. Howard's heart sank. Then the static softened. A familiar crackle filled the room. And suddenly, clear and unmistakable, a voice emerged from the radio, warm, steady, alive. Mr. Howard gasped. His breath hitched as he leaned forward, eyes locked on the radio. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks as the sound washed over him. He reached out with trembling hands, not touching it, just hovering there, as if afraid the moment might vanish. "Oh," he whispered. "Oh, my love." The radio played on, just as it always had. Mr. Howard broke down then, covering his face, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Annie stood beside the table, quiet and still, watching him with solemn eyes. She had fixed the radio, but she had also given something back that could not be replaced. And in that moment, as the old voice filled the room once more, Mr. Howard realized that the smallest hands sometimes carried the greatest repairs. The radio played on, steady and clear, as if nothing bad had ever happened to it. For a few seconds, Mr. Howard didn't move. He simply stared at the table, his eyes fixed on the small wooden box that had just brought a voice back from the dead. His mouth trembled. His chest rose and fell too fast, like he had just run a long distance without realizing it. Then, slowly, he reached out. His hands shook as he slid the radio toward himself. Annie instinctively stepped closer, ready to catch it if it slipped. But Mr. Howard was careful, more careful than he had been with anything in years. He lifted the radio with both hands, cradling it against his chest the way someone might hold a sleeping child. The sound grew slightly muffled, pressed against his sweater, and that was when he broke. A sharp, broken sound tore out of him, halfway between a laugh and a sob. His shoulders collapsed inward as if something inside him had finally given up the fight. Tears poured freely now, not the quiet kind from before, but the kind that came all at once, unstoppable. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's her. It's really her." Backstage. If this moment touched you even a little, please take a second to show your support. Tap like, leave a comment, and tell us where you are watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. He pressed his forehead against the radio, eyes squeezed shut, breathing uneven. The voice from the speaker continued, calm and patient, unaware of the storm it had unleashed. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his words cracking apart. "I thought I lost the last piece." Annie stood very still. She had never seen a grown man cry like this. Not politely, not with restraint. This was grief with its doors thrown wide open. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look away. She knew better. Mr. Howard sank back into the chair, still holding the radio, rocking slightly without realizing it. Tears soaked into the fabric of his sweater. His fingers tightened around the edges of the radio as if afraid someone might take it from him. "I used to tease her," he said through broken breaths. "I told her we could buy a new one. A better one. She always said no." He let out a shaky laugh. "She said this one knew her." He looked down at the radio, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I didn't understand what she meant. Not until now." Annie swallowed. "It's working," she said softly. Not as a reminder, but as reassurance. Mr. Howard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He reached out and turned the volume down just a little, enough so the voice filled the room without overwhelming it. The sound settled into the space, warm and familiar, like it belonged there. "You gave me something back," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Something I didn't think I'd ever hear again." Annie shifted her weight. "It just needed a wire," she said. Mr. Howard looked at her, eyes red and shining. "No," he said gently. "It needed you, Itzy." He took a long breath and placed the radio back on the table, this time with intention, setting it exactly where it used to sit. He leaned back in the chair, exhausted, his hands resting on his knees. "Thank you," he said again, quieter now, but deeper. "I don't know how to thank you properly." Annie shook her head. "You don't have to." The room grew calm again. The kind of calm that comes after something heavy has passed through and finally moved on. The radio continued its program, as faithful as ever. A moment later, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway drifted in through the windows. Mr. Howard stiffened slightly. That's my son, he said. Annie's shoulders tightened. She had heard that word before. Son. Daniel Howard. The man who owned the house. The man her mother worked for. The man she rarely saw, even though his presence was everywhere. The front door opened. Footsteps crossed the marble floor. Daniel entered the living room mid-step and stopped short. He frowned. The radio? He said. Mr. Howard smiled weakly. Yes. Daniel looked from the radio to his father, then to Annie, standing beside the table. Confusion crossed his face. I thought that thing was done for. So did I, Mr. Howard replied. Until she fixed it. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Annie. She fixed it? Yes, Mr. Howard said, his voice firm now. She heard it fall. She helped me up. She didn't panic. She didn't treat it like junk. He gestured toward Annie. She treated it like it mattered. Daniel stepped closer, examining the radio, then the back panel. He looked genuinely surprised. How long did this take? About an hour, Annie said quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's impressive. Mr. Howard leaned forward. It's more than that, he said. She gave me my mornings back. Daniel glanced at his father, then at the radio, then at Annie again. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but real. What's your name? He asked. Annie. And how old are you? 6. Daniel paused. 6. He looked down at the small girl with new eyes. My wife listened to that station, Mr. Howard added. Every morning. This house hasn't sounded like this since she died. Daniel swallowed. He hadn't realized how quiet it had been. He hadn't noticed what silence had done to his father. Thank you, he said to Annie, his voice lower now, more serious. You did something important today. Annie nodded, unsure how to respond. Daniel checked his watch. I have a call, he said, but I want to talk later. Please don't leave right away. Yes, sir, Annie replied. Daniel headed toward the stairs, then paused, listening as the radio's voice followed him upward. He stood still for a moment longer than necessary before continuing. In the living room, Mr. Howard closed his eyes again. The radio's sound settling into him like a memory restored. You know, he said softly, I don't feel alone right now. Annie picked up her cleaning cloth and returned to her work. She moved quietly, respectfully, leaving the radio exactly where it was. Behind her, Mr. Howard listened, holding on to the sound with both hands and his whole heart. The house settled into a different rhythm after Daniel went upstairs. The radio continued to play, its voice steady and unhurried, filling the living room with a presence that felt almost human. Mr. Howard sat with his eyes closed, his head resting lightly against the back of the chair. His hands lay open on his knees now, no longer clenched, no longer guarding himself against the quiet. Annie moved carefully around the room, picking up where she had left off. She wiped the coffee table, straightened the stack of magazines, folded the blanket draped over the arm of the couch. She worked the way she always did, quiet, efficient, invisible when possible, but something had changed. She could feel it, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. Mr. Howard opened his eyes and watched her for a moment. You don't have to rush, he said gently. You've done more than enough today. Annie paused. My mom says work isn't finished until it's finished, she replied. He smiled faintly. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is, Annie said without hesitation. He nodded, as if that settled something important. Is she feeling better today? Annie's hands slowed. Some days are good, she said. Some days she gets tired just standing up. Mr. Howard's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. That's hard, he said quietly. Annie shrugged, but her eyes stayed on the floor. We just do what we can. The radio shifted to a new segment, the host's voice softer now, reflective. Mr. Howard listened, then spoke again, more carefully this time. How long have you been helping your mother work? Since I was 5, Annie said. She said I was careful enough. Mr. Howard let out a slow breath. 5. He thought of Daniel at that age, nannies, tutors, endless protection. He felt something tighten in his chest. You shouldn't have to worry about grown-up things so soon, he said. Annie looked up at him, puzzled. Someone has to. He had no answer for that. Footsteps sounded overhead. A door opened, then closed. The radio kept playing, unaware of the quiet reckoning happening beneath its steady voice. Annie finished the living room and moved toward the hallway. She paused near the doorway, glancing back at Mr. Howard. He was watching the radio again, but this time his expression wasn't broken. It was thoughtful, almost peaceful. "Mr. Howard?" she asked. "Yes, Annie. If the radio sounds funny again," she said carefully, "I can look at it." He smiled, a real smile this time. "I believe you," he said. Upstairs, Daniel stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, but his attention drifted. The radio's voice carried faintly through the floor, threading its way into the room. He hadn't heard that sound in years. Not since his mother died, not since the house decided to go quiet instead. He muted his call and stood still, listening. Memories surfaced uninvited. His mother in the kitchen, humming along to the radio. His father in the living room, pretending not to listen. Daniel himself passing through, always on his way somewhere else. He unmuted the phone and finished the call quickly, his answers shorter than usual. When he hung up, he didn't sit back down. He left the office and headed downstairs instead. He stopped at the top of the staircase. From there, he could see Annie in the hallway, putting away cleaning supplies with practiced efficiency. He could see his father in the living room, sitting straighter than he had in months, his eyes open, his face turned toward the sound. Daniel leaned against the banister, watching. He had built companies, managed thousands of employees, made decisions that moved money and people across continents. And yet, he had missed this. The quiet erosion, the loneliness, the way a house could slowly hollow out while still standing. Annie finished and turned toward the front door, reaching for her small jacket. "Leaving already?" Daniel asked, stepping forward. She startled slightly, then nodded. "Yes, sir. My mom's waiting." He glanced at the clock. "It's still early. She worries," Annie said simply. He considered her for a moment. "I'll have someone drive you home." Annie shook her head quickly. "No, sir. We take the bus." "Isder?" Daniel frowned. "It's not safe for a child your age to." "I'm careful," Annie said. "And my mom knows the stops." Mr. Howard spoke up from his chair. "She's more capable than most adults I know," he said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel looked at his father, surprised by the edge in his tone. "All right," Daniel said finally. "But next time, we'll talk about it." Annie nodded, slipping on her jacket. She hesitated, then turned back toward Mr. Howard. "Goodbye," she said. He smiled at her. "Thank you," he replied. "For everything." She gave a small nod and headed out. The door closed softly behind her. The radio continued to play. Daniel walked into the living room and sat across from his father. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound filled the space between them, doing the work words couldn't. She fixed it with her own hands, Mr. Howard said at last. "No fear, no expectation." Daniel nodded slowly. "I saw." Mr. Howard turned to him. "When did we stop noticing people like her?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe when we thought someone else was handling it." Mr. Howard sighed. "That's how things break," he said, quietly, "until one day, they fall." Daniel looked at the radio, then at his father. He felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. Not guilt exactly. Something heavier. Responsibility. Down the street, Annie walked toward the bus stop, her steps light but her thoughts busy. She replayed the moment the radio came back to life. The look on Mr. Howard's face when he lifted it and cried. She didn't know why it stayed with her so strongly. She only knew it mattered. At home, her mother waited, listening for the sound of the door. Annie smiled as she walked. She had fixed a radio, but she had also started something else. The bus ride home took longer than usual. Annie sat near the window, her feet dangling above the floor, watching the city slide past in slow pieces. Storefronts, traffic lights, a man walking his dog. She held her small canvas tool bag on her lap, fingers curled tightly around the worn strap. as if letting go might cause the day to disappear. She replayed the moment again and again, the sound returning to the radio. Mr. Howard lifting it with shaking hands, the way his face had crumpled as if years had suddenly caught up with him. Annie didn't fully understand why it stayed with her so strongly. She only knew it felt important, like something had shifted, not just for him, but for her too. When she stepped off the bus, the afternoon sun pressed down on her shoulders. She walked the last 2 blocks quickly, cutting through a narrow sidewalk lined with tired houses and overgrown hedges. This part of the neighborhood was quieter than the resort, but not in the same way. Here, silence came from people keeping to themselves, not from empty rooms. She pushed open the front door and slipped inside. Her mother was lying on the couch, propped up with pillows, the television murmuring softly in the background. She turned her head as Annie entered, relief crossing her tired face. "You're home," she said. "Yes, Mama," Annie replied, slipping off her shoes. "How did it go today?" Annie hesitated, then walked over and sat on the edge of the couch. "I fixed something," she said. Her mother smiled faintly. "You always do." "No," Annie said, more seriously. "I fixed something important." Her mother studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Tell me." Annie told her about the radio, about the fall, about Mr. Howard crying when the sound came back. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. "That was kind of you," she said when Annie finished. "I didn't do it to be kind," Annie replied. "It just needed fixing." Her mother reached out and brushed Annie's hair back gently. "That's what kindness usually looks like," she said. "People just don't notice it when it's quiet." Annie leaned into her mother's hand, tired now that the day was over. "Mama," she asked, "why was he so sad?" Her mother closed her eyes for a moment. "Because he lost someone he loved," she said softly. "And because sometimes people with big houses have very small company." Annie thought about Mr. Howard sitting alone in the living room, listening to the radio every morning. She nodded slowly. That night, Annie fell asleep quickly. Across town, the resort house stayed awake longer than usual. Daniel sat in his office. The door open, paperwork spread across his desk. He tried to focus on emails, on schedules, on the constant pull of things that demanded his attention. But the radio's voice drifted faintly through the house, threading its way upstairs. He hadn't turned it off. His father had insisted it stay on, just as it used to. Same station, same volume. Daniel found himself pausing mid-sentence, mid-thought, listening without meaning to. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood. He walked downstairs and found his father in the living room, sitting in the same chair as earlier, the radio on the table beside him. Mr. Howard looked up as Daniel entered. "You're still awake," Daniel said. "So are you," his father replied. Daniel smiled slightly and sat across from him. For a moment, they just listened. "She didn't have to do that," Mr. Howard said suddenly. Daniel nodded. "No, she didn't, and yet she did." "Yes, Mr. Howard turned to his son. "When was the last time you sat in this room with your mother and listened to this station?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't remember. He had been busy even then, always busy. "I don't know," he admitted. Mr. Howard sighed. Not in accusation, but in acceptance. "I forgot how much noise matters," he said. "Not loud noise, familiar noise." Daniel looked at the radio. "I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten," he said. "That's the danger," his father replied. "You don't notice the quiet until something breaks." Daniel thought of Annie standing beside the table, small and steady, saying she could fix it. He thought of how easily he had underestimated her, how easily he underestimated people like her. "She's 6, he said quietly. "Yes," Mr. Howard agreed. "And she saw what we didn't." Daniel leaned back, rubbing his face with one hand. "Her mother is sick," he said. "She shouldn't be worrying about buses and cleaning houses." Mr. Howard studied him. "Are you thinking about doing something because you feel guilty?" he asked. "Or because it's right?" Daniel met his gaze. "Does it matter?" His father considered this. "It matters, if you want it to last." Daniel nodded slowly. The next morning, Annie returned to the resort. She worked the same way she always did, moving quietly, keeping her head down. But the house felt different now, less heavy. The radio greeted her as she entered, its voice warm and familiar. Mr. Howard smiled when he saw her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Annie replied. Daniel watched from the hallway. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak right away. He simply observed the way his father relaxed in Annie's presence, the way the house seemed to respond to sound and movement again. Later that afternoon, when Annie finished her work and reached for her jacket, Daniel stepped forward. "Annie," he said. She looked up at him, cautious but polite. "Yes, sir? I'd like to talk to your mother," he said. "About her health." Annie's grip tightened on her jacket. She didn't do anything wrong. Daniel shook his head. "I know," he said gently. "This isn't about that." Annie hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Daniel glanced at his father, who gave him a small, approving nod. The radio played on, and somewhere between sound and silence, between what had been broken and what had been restored, the shape of something new began to form. Annie didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her small bed, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling, listening to her mother's breathing from the other room. Every so often, the sound changed slower, heavier, and Annie held her breath with it, counting silently until it evened out again. When she was sure her mother was sleeping, Annie finally let her eyes close. She dreamed of wires and voices, of hands too big and hands too small, of something broken being lifted carefully and made whole again. Morning came quietly. Annie woke before the alarm, dressed herself, and warmed a bowl of oatmeal the way her mother liked it, not too thick, not too thin. She carried it to the couch and set it down carefully. "You're up early," her mother murmured. "Work day," Annie said. Her mother smiled, then winced slightly as she tried to sit up. Annie noticed. She always noticed. "Don't hurry," her mother said. "If you're tired." "I'm okay," Annie replied, already reaching for her jacket. The bus ride felt longer than usual. Annie watched people climb on and off. Adults with heavy eyes, hands clutching coffee cups and phones. No one paid attention to her, and she was used to that. Still, her stomach felt tight as the resort gates came into view. When she stepped off the bus, the guard nodded at her, just as he always did. Annie nodded back and walked up the long drive toward the house. The radio greeted her before the front door fully opened. The sound spilled out into the hallway, steady and familiar. Annie paused for half a second, listening, then went inside. "Good morning," Mr. Howard called from the living room. "Good morning," Annie replied. He was already seated in his chair, a cup of coffee resting on the side table. The radio sat where it belonged, its surface polished, its voice clear. Mr. Howard looked different today, straighter, more awake. "I didn't turn it off," he said, almost defensively. "I slept better with it on." Annie nodded. "It likes being used." He smiled at that. "I think you're right." She went about her work as usual, but she could feel his eyes on her from time to time, not watching to supervise, but watching the way people watched something they were afraid might disappear. A little while later, Daniel came downstairs. He wasn't on the phone. That alone felt unusual. "Morning," he said. "Morning," his father replied. Daniel glanced at Annie. "Good morning." "Good morning, sir," Annie said. Daniel hesitated, then continued into the kitchen. He poured himself coffee, stood there for a moment, and then spoke without turning around. "I'd like to talk to your mother today," he said to Annie. "If she's willing." Annie froze. She had expected this, and yet she hadn't. Her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand. "She's sick," Annie said carefully. "She can't come here. With Regnis." "I know," Daniel said. "I can come to her." Annie looked at Mr. Howard, unsure. Mr. Howard met her gaze and nodded gently. "It's all right," he said. "You've done nothing wrong." Annie swallowed. "Okay." Daniel turned around then, his expression serious but not unkind. "I'll meet you after work," he said. "If that's all right." Annie nodded again. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Annie cleaned, dusted, folded, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her mother. She wondered what Daniel would say. She wondered what her mother would think. She wondered if she had done something wrong by fixing the radio, by being noticed at all. By early afternoon, Daniel was ready. "I'll drive you," he said. Annie climbed into the back seat of the car, her feet barely touching the floor. She watched the neighborhood change through the window as they drove. Clean streets gave way to cracked sidewalks. Tall hedges became chain-link fences. Daniel noticed the shift too. He grew quieter the farther they went. When they arrived, Annie led him inside. Her mother struggled to sit up when she saw him. "You don't need to stand," Daniel said quickly. "Please." He took a seat across from her, hands resting on his knees. For a moment, no one spoke. "Your daughter fixed my father's radio," Daniel said finally. Her mother smiled faintly. "She's good with her hands." "She's good with more than that," he replied. "She helped him when he fell. She stayed calm. She gave him something back." Her mother listened carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. "I want to help," Daniel said. "With your health, with treatment, with whatever you need." Her mother stiffened. "I don't want charity." Daniel nodded. "I understand. This isn't that." "Then what is it?" she asked. "It's responsibility," he said. "My father was cared for today by a child who should have been worrying about school, not adults falling down." He paused. "That shouldn't be how the world works." Annie's mother closed her eyes briefly. "I don't want her to owe anyone," she said quietly. "She won't," Daniel replied. "This doesn't come with strings." Silence settled over the room. Finally, Annie's mother nodded once. "If it helps her," she said, "then I'll accept." Daniel stood. "It will." H-ing. On the drive back, Annie watched the road again. Her thoughts quieter now. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she felt something ease in her chest. Back at the house, Mr. Howard waited in his chair. "Well?" he asked. Daniel met his father's eyes. "We'll take care of it." Mr. Howard exhaled, relief softening his features. "Good." The radio played on. Annie returned to her work, the cloth moving in steady circles. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just worked, but something had shifted again, and none of them could pretend not to feel it. The next few days passed quietly, but the quiet was different now. Annie noticed it first in the mornings. Her mother's breathing sounded a little steadier, not healed, not fixed, but less strained, as if her body had finally been given permission to rest instead of endure. When Annie brought her oatmeal, her mother managed to sit up without wincing, and that alone felt like a small miracle. "They called," her mother said one morning, voice cautious but hopeful. "The clinic Daniel arranged. They want to run new tests." Annie nodded, absorbing the words slowly. Clinics, tests. These were big words, grown-up words, words that usually came with worry. But this time, they came with something else too, possibility. At the resort house, the radio had become part of the rhythm again. Mr. Howard turned it on as soon as he woke up and left it playing long after breakfast. Sometimes he didn't even listen closely. It was enough to know it was there, filling the space between walls that had been silent for too long. Annie worked as she always had, but Mr. Howard spoke to her more now. Not constantly, just enough to remind her she wasn't invisible. "Did you eat?" he asked one morning as she wiped the counter. "Yes, sir." "Good." He paused. "You should never work on an empty stomach." She nodded solemnly, as if this were an important rule. Daniel watched these exchanges from a distance. He had canceled 2 trips that week, told his assistant to reschedule meetings. No explanations. He found himself staying home longer, noticing things he hadn't before, the way his father's shoulders relaxed when the radio played, the way Annie moved through the house without noise but with purpose. One afternoon, Daniel stood in the doorway of the living room as Annie adjusted a stack of books on the shelf. "Do you go to school?" he asked. Annie turned to face him. "Yes, sir." "IT. Do you like it?" She thought for a moment. "I like reading," she said. "And math." He smiled slightly. "Those are useful things." Mr. Howard chuckled from his chair. Understatement of the year. Daniel stepped further into the room. "Annie," he said carefully, "would you like to learn more about how things work? Radios, electronics." Her eyes widened, just a little. "Yes, sir." He nodded. I thought you might. Mr. Howard raised an eyebrow. You planning to teach her yourself? Daniel shook his head. No. I'm planning to find someone who knows what they're doing. Annie didn't say anything, but her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand. That evening, Daniel sat with his father as the radio played softly. You're changing things, Mr. Howard said. Daniel looked at him. Am I? Yes, his father replied. You're slowing down, paying attention. He smiled faintly. Your mother would have liked that. Daniel swallowed. I wish she were here. So do I, Mr. Howard said. But she left us some instructions. Daniel glanced at the radio. Not everything valuable comes with a price tag, his father continued. Some things just need to be cared for. Daniel nodded slowly. The following week, Annie's mother began treatment. The clinic was clean and bright, with chairs that didn't squeak and nurses who spoke gently. Annie sat beside her mother, swinging her legs, watching as doctors explained things in calm voices. For the first time in a long while, the words didn't sound like warnings. They sounded like plans. At the house, Mr. Howard asked about it every day. How's your mother? He would ask. She's tired, Annie would answer, but she smiles more. That's a good sign, he'd say. One afternoon, Annie found Mr. Howard standing near the radio, holding a small photograph. This was your grandmother, he said, showing her. Daniel's mother. Annie studied the picture. A woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. She liked fixing things too, Mr. Howard said. Not radios, people. Annie nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the truth of it anyway. Later that day, Daniel returned home with a small box. He set it on the table and looked at Annie. This is for you, he said. She hesitated. I didn't do anything. I know, he replied. That's why. Well, inside the box was a simple toolkit. New, clean, carefully chosen. Annie touched it reverently. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Use it well. That night, after Annie left, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The radio played softly. He thought about the pace he used to live at, the deals, the flights, the constant motion, and he thought about a 6-year-old girl who had stopped long enough to fix something everyone else had written off as broken. He realized then that some repairs didn't require power or money or authority. They required presence, and that, more than anything, was what he had been missing. The toolkit stayed in Annie's bag for 3 days before she opened it. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't know where to put something that felt that important. At home, space was limited. The kitchen table doubled as a desk. The couch was a bed when her mother's pain grew too strong. Everything had its place because there was no room for anything extra. New things usually meant something else had to go. On the 4th evening, Annie finally set the toolkit on the table and unlatched it. The metal clicked softly. Inside, each tool rested in its own space, clean and precise. Screwdrivers with proper grips, wire cutters that closed smoothly, a small multimeter she didn't fully understand yet but recognized from pictures she'd seen in old books at the library. Her mother watched from the couch. That's a serious set, she said. Annie nodded. Mr. Daniel gave it to me. I think. With her governed advices. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Did he say why? He said to use it well. Her mother smiled faintly. Then that's what you'll do. Annie ran her fingers over the tools, not taking any out yet. She closed the case again carefully and slid it under the table, where it would be safe. The next morning, the bus ride felt shorter. When Annie arrived at the resort, the guard greeted her by name for the first time. She nodded back, surprised but pleased. Small changes, she was learning, mattered. Inside the house, the radio was already on. Mr. Howard sat by the window, sunlight warming his hands as he listened. He turned when he heard Annie's footsteps. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she replied. You're early, she shrugged. The bus was fast today, he smiled. Come sit for a moment. Annie hesitated. She wasn't used to being invited to sit, but she obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair opposite him. I was thinking, Mr. Howard said, tapping the armrest lightly. About that day the radio fell. Annie listened. I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count, he continued. Not the fall. What happened after? She waited. You didn't panic, he said. Most adults would have. They would have yelled, blamed themselves, blamed the furniture. He shook his head. You saw a problem and went straight to fixing it. Annie looked down at her hands. Someone had to. Mr. Howard nodded. That's what worries me. She looked up, confused. Children shouldn't have to be the calmest ones in the room, he said gently. Before Annie could respond, Daniel entered. He looked more rested than usual. No phone in his hand, no jacket over his arm. Morning, he said. Morning, his father replied. Daniel glanced at Annie. How's your mother today? She's okay, Annie said. She has another appointment tomorrow. Good, Daniel replied. I'll check in after. It is. Annie nodded, unsure what to say. Daniel turned to his father. I spoke with the clinic again last night. They're optimistic. Mr. Howard closed his eyes briefly. That's good news. It is. Daniel agreed. Annie excused herself and went to work. As she cleaned, she noticed small things she hadn't before. A loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. A lamp that flickered when turned on. A clock in the hallway that ticked unevenly, like it was struggling to keep time. Normally, she would have ignored them. Not her place. Not her job. But today, she paused. She finished her assigned work first, careful not to rush. Then she approached Mr. Howard. There are some things, she said quietly. Small things. I could fix them. Mr. Howard looked at her, then at the lamp, then back at her. Would you like to? Yes, sir, he smiled. Then I think the house would appreciate it. Daniel watched from the doorway as Annie retrieved her toolkit. She worked slowly, methodically. Tightening a screw, replacing a bulb, adjusting the clock until its ticking evened out. Each fix was small, almost unnoticeable on its own, but together, they changed the feel of the space. The house felt less tired. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. You notice things, he said when she finished. Annie nodded. They tell you when something's wrong. He frowned slightly. How? She thought for a moment. They stopped sounding right. Mr. Howard chuckled. Just like people. Daniel exhaled. Yes, he said. Just like people. Later that afternoon, Daniel received a call. He listened, his expression darkening slightly. When he hung up, he stayed where he was, staring at the screen longer than necessary. Mr. Howard noticed. Bad news? Daniel shook his head. Complicated news. He hesitated, then said, The board wants me to resume travel next month. Full schedule. Mr. Howard's gaze shifted to the radio, then back to his son. And what do you want? Daniel didn't answer right away. I don't know, he said finally. I'm starting to think I've been very efficient at the wrong things. Mr. Howard nodded. Efficiency without care is how things break. Daniel smiled ruefully. You're quoting her now. She was usually right, Mr. Howard replied. Annie listened from across the room, understanding only parts of the conversation, but feeling its weight. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Daniel stopped her. Annie, he said, kneeling slightly so they were closer to eye level. If you ever see something that needs fixing here, you can tell me. Or fix it yourself. Either way, she nodded. Okay, and, he added, school comes first. Yes, sir. Mr. Howard watched her go, the radio humming softly beside him. She's changing the house, he said. Daniel shook his head. No, he said quietly. The house is letting us see what was already broken. Outside, Annie walked toward the bus stop, the toolkit heavier in her bag than it used to be, not because of the tools, but because of what they meant. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. Fixing things had consequences. Some of them were just beginning. The first thing Annie noticed was the quiet, not the empty kind, not the heavy kind that pressed on your chest. This quiet felt alert, as if the house itself was listening. She stepped inside just after 8, brushing dust from her shoes at the door. The radio was on, but lower than usual. A man's voice spoke calmly about the weather, about traffic, about things that mattered to people who had somewhere to be. Mr. Howard sat by the window, a folded newspaper resting on his lap. Good morning, Annie, he said. Good morning, sir. You hear that? He asked. tilting his head slightly. She listened. The radio? No, he said with a faint smile. The house. Annie stood still for a moment. Then she nodded. It's quieter, she said, but not sad. Free Hill, Mr. Howard exhaled. That's exactly it. She went to work, moving through the rooms with practiced care. As she dusted, she noticed that someone had straightened the picture frames on the mantel. The crooked one, the one she had fixed yesterday, was still straight. Someone had noticed. In the kitchen, Daniel stood at the counter, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when Annie entered. Morning, he said. Morning, sir. He hesitated, then set the tablet down. I won't be home much today, he said. I have meetings in the city. Annie nodded. Okay, but, he added, I'll be back for dinner. Mr. Howard looked up from his chair. That's new. Daniel met his father's gaze. I'm trying something. Mr. Howard smiled. So is the rest of the house. Daniel left shortly after, the sound of the front door closing soft but final. Annie watched him go, then returned to her work. Mid-morning, Mr. Howard surprised her. Would you like some toast? He asked. Annie froze, cloth in hand. I already ate. I know, he said gently. But would you like some anyway? She thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, sir. They sat at the table together. He buttered the toast slowly, deliberately, as if relearning the motion. Annie ate quietly, careful not to make crumbs. My wife used to say breakfast tasted better when shared, he said. Annie nodded. My mom says that too. He smiled at that. Your mother sounds like a very sensible woman. Annie finished eating and returned to her work. But something about the moment stayed with her. The way he had asked, the way he had waited for her answer. Later that afternoon, as she adjusted the curtains in the guest room, she heard raised voices downstairs. Not shouting, not yet, but tight, controlled. Annie paused. She knew that sound too. She crept closer to the doorway, staying out of sight. Can't keep rearranging schedules like this, a man's voice said. The board is already concerned. Daniel's voice followed, calm but firm. The board can wait. This is not how leadership works. No, Daniel replied. This is exactly how it should work. There was a pause. You're letting personal matters interfere with. I'm letting reality interfere, Daniel cut in. There's a difference. Annie stepped back quietly, her heart pounding. She didn't fully understand what they were arguing about, but she understood tension. She understood when adults were pulling against something they couldn't quite see yet. When the voices faded, she returned to her task, hands a little shakier than before. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than expected. He didn't go upstairs. He went straight to the living room. Dad, he said, can we talk? Mr. Howard turned down the radio slightly. Of course. Annie pretended to focus on the bookshelf, but she listened. They're pushing back, Daniel said. Hard. Mr. Howard nodded. They always do when something changes. Daniel rubbed his temples. They think I'm distracted, that I'm losing focus. And are you? Mr. Howard asked. Daniel looked at the radio, at Annie's reflection in the glass cabinet, at his father sitting straighter than he had in years. No, he said quietly. I think I'm finally paying attention. Mr. Howard smiled. Then let them worry. Annie finished her work and gathered her things. As she reached the door, Daniel called her name. Annie, she turned. How's your mother today? She smiled this morning, Annie said, before the medicine made her sleepy. Daniel nodded. That matters. Today. He hesitated, then said, tomorrow, I'd like you to come a little earlier. Annie stiffened slightly. Did I do something wrong? No, he said quickly. The opposite. I want you to meet someone. She looked to Mr. Howard, uncertain. Mr. Howard gave her a reassuring nod. You'll be fine. Annie nodded slowly. Okay. That night, as she lay in bed, Annie thought about the voices she had heard, about the way the house felt different now, about how fixing small things seemed to make big ones move. She didn't know who she was meeting tomorrow. She didn't know why her chest felt tight with both excitement and worry. But she knew this. Things were changing again, and not everyone liked it. Annie arrived earlier than usual the next morning. The sky was still pale, the sun not fully awake yet. She stepped off the bus, clutching her tool bag a little tighter than normal, her stomach fluttering with a feeling she couldn't name. Daniel had said he wanted her to meet someone. He hadn't explained why. Adults often didn't. At the gate, the guard smiled and waved her through without checking his clipboard. Inside the house, the radio was already playing. Mr. Howard sat at the table with a cup of coffee. His posture relaxed, his eyes alert. He looked up when Annie entered and smiled. "You're early," he said. "Yes, sir. Good," he replied. "It's a good day to be early." Annie wasn't sure what that meant, but she nodded anyway. Daniel came downstairs a few minutes later, dressed neatly, but without a tie. His phone was in his pocket, not in his hand. That alone made Annie nervous. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir," Annie replied. He looked at her carefully, as if weighing something. "Are you ready?" "For what?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "You'll see." They didn't wait long. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected in the quiet house. Annie jumped slightly. Mr. Howard chuckled. "I'll get it," Daniel said. Annie stood very still as Daniel opened the door. A man stepped inside, tall and thin, with gray hair and glasses perched low on his nose. He carried a leather briefcase and looked around the room with curiosity, not judgment. "This is Professor Allen," Daniel said. "He teaches electrical engineering at the community college." The man smiled warmly and crouched slightly to Annie's level. "You must be Annie," he said. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Annie blinked. "You have? Enough to be curious," he replied. "And curiosity is my job." She glanced at Mr. Howard, who gave her an encouraging nod. Professor Allen straightened and looked at the radio. "So this is the famous patient," he said. Mr. Howard smiled. "She saved its life." Professor Allen chuckled. "That's impressive. These older radios can be stubborn." He turned back to Annie. "Daniel tells me you fixed it without instructions." Annie nodded. "The wire was loose." Professor Allen raised his eyebrows. "And how did you know that?" She shrugged. "It stopped sounding right." Daniel watched closely. Professor Allen opened his briefcase and pulled out a small device, setting it on the table. "Would you like to see something?" Annie hesitated, then nodded. He explained slowly, carefully, showing her how electricity moved through wires, how sound traveled and became something people could hear. He didn't rush. He didn't talk down to her. He asked questions and waited for her answers. Annie listened, wide-eyed. Mr. Howard watched from his chair, his chest warm with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, maybe, or relief. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed loosely, absorbing every word. After an hour, Professor Allen closed his briefcase. "She's remarkable," he said quietly to Daniel. "Not because she fixed a radio, because she listens." Daniel nodded. "That's what I noticed too." Professor Allen turned to Annie. "If you ever want to learn more," he said, "there are books, classes, people who can help." Annie looked up at him. "Even if I'm little?" He smiled. "Especially because you are." After he left, the house felt different again. Not heavier, fuller. Annie returned to her work, but her thoughts raced. Books, classes, learning more. The ideas felt too big to hold all at once. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat with his father. "She doesn't know what she did yet," Daniel said. Mr. Howard nodded. "That's how it starts." Daniel leaned back, rubbing his jaw. The board called again. "And?" Mr. Howard asked. "They don't like this," Daniel said. "They think I'm wasting time." Mr. Howard looked at the radio, then back at his son. "Time spent doing the right thing is never wasted." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm starting to believe that." Annie finished her work and waited near the door. "Annie," Daniel said, stopping her. "Your mother's appointment is tomorrow. I'll make sure everything's ready." She nodded. "Thank you. Well, go." He hesitated, then added, "What you did here matters, even if others don't see it yet." Annie thought about the radio, about Mr. Howard crying, about the house listening. "I know," she said quietly. As she left, the radio's voice followed her down the hall, steady and patient. Outside, the sun had risen fully now. Annie walked toward the bus stop, her steps light, her thoughts busy. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know how far things would go, but she knew this. Something that had started with a broken radio was no longer just about sound. It was about being heard. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and coffee. Annie sat in the hard plastic chair beside her mother, her feet swinging just above the floor, hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the low murmur of voices drifting in from the hallway. Her mother leaned back against the chair, eyes closed, breathing slow but uneven. "You okay?" Annie whispered. Her mother opened her eyes and smiled. "I'm okay, baby. Just tired." Annie nodded. Tired was something she understood. A nurse called her mother's name. They stood together, Annie holding her mother's hand as they followed the nurse down the hall. The walls were lined with framed photographs, smiling doctors, grateful families, words about care and commitment. Annie read them slowly as they passed, sounding the big words out in her head. Inside the examination room, the doctor spoke calmly, explaining tests and treatments, next steps and timelines. Annie didn't understand everything, but she understood the tone. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dismissive. It felt careful. When the doctor left, her mother let out a long breath. "They're going to help," she said quietly, as if afraid to say it too loudly. Annie squeezed her hand. "I know." Outside, a black car waited. Daniel stood beside it, hands in his coat pockets. He nodded when he saw them. "How did it go?" he asked. Her mother studied his face before answering. "They listened," she said. "That's new." Daniel nodded. "It shouldn't be." The drive back was quiet. Annie watched the city pass by, her thoughts heavy but hopeful. When they reached home, Daniel walked them to the door. "I'll check in tomorrow," he said. "If you need anything before then, you call." Her mother hesitated. "Thank you," she said, "for treating us like people." Daniel met her gaze. "You are." That evening, Annie returned to the resort house. The radio was on, as always. Mr. Howard sat with a notebook on his lap, a pen resting loosely in his hand. He looked up when Annie entered. "How did it go?" he asked. "They're going to help my mom," Annie said. His face softened. "I'm glad." She went about her work, but she noticed Mr. Howard writing something down, pausing, crossing things out. After a while, he closed the notebook. "I used to keep journals," he said suddenly. "After my wife passed. I stopped when it hurt too much to remember." "Was now." Annie dusted quietly. "I started again today," he continued. "The radio helped." She nodded. "It remembers things." "Yes," he said. "It does." Later, Daniel joined them. He looked tired. Not the usual kind. This was a deeper tired, the kind that came from pushing against something heavy. "They scheduled a board meeting," he said to his father. "In person." Mr. Howard raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." "They want answers," Daniel replied. "About my priorities." Mr. Howard smiled faintly. "And what are your priorities?" Daniel glanced at Annie, then back at his father. "I'm figuring that out." That night, after Annie left, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The radio played softly. He stared at the darkened window, his reflection faint in the glass. He thought about the boardroom, about expectations and numbers, about the invisible lines he had followed his entire adult life without question. He thought about a 6-year-old girl fixing a radio because it mattered to someone. He picked up his phone and typed an email. Then another. He canceled a trip. He reassigned a meeting. He felt resistance already. Imagined the conversations that would follow. He sent the messages anyway. The next day, the board meeting was tense. Daniel sat at the head of the table, listening as concerns were raised. Voices sharpened. Words like focus and risk and optics filled the room. "This isn't sustainable," one man said. "You're letting personal distractions interfere with leadership." Daniel folded his hands calmly. "I disagree." Another voice chimed in. "We hired you to grow this company, not run a charity." Daniel met their eyes one by one. "I'm running a company," he said. "I'm just refusing to do it blind." Silence followed. "This isn't about charity," he continued. It's about responsibility. If we can't see the people affected by our decisions, then growth doesn't mean much. A woman across the table frowned. You're talking philosophy. I'm talking consequences, Daniel replied. The meeting ended without resolution. At the house, Mr. Howard waited. Daniel arrived late, shoulders tense, jaw tight. He loosened his tie and sat heavily in the chair across from his father. They don't like it, he said. Mr. Howard nodded. They rarely do when comfort is threatened. Daniel stared at the radio. What if I lose control of the company? Mr. Howard considered him carefully. Then you'll still have control of yourself, he said. And that's harder to earn. Daniel exhaled slowly. Annie arrived the next morning to find the house buzzing with a quiet energy. Daniel was home. Mr. Howard was dressed neatly. The radio played louder than usual. Good morning, Annie said. Good morning, Daniel replied. We're going to have company today. Do I? Annie's stomach tightened slightly. Did I do something wrong? Daniel shook his head. No. But some people need to see what I see. She nodded. Uncertain, as she set down her bag, she glanced at the radio, then at Mr. Howard. He smiled reassuringly. Sometimes, Annie was learning. Fixing something small was only the beginning. The house had never hosted a board meeting before. Annie could tell something was different the moment she stepped inside. The air felt tighter, like it did right before a storm. The radio was still playing, but lower now, as if someone had asked it to be polite. Mr. Howard sat upright in his chair, dressed in a pressed shirt instead of his usual sweater. Daniel stood near the window, phone silent in his hand, his expression focused but calm. Good morning, Annie said softly. Good morning, Mr. Howard replied, his voice warm despite the tension. Come in. Annie set her bag down carefully, suddenly unsure of where she belonged today. She had been told there would be company. No one had explained what kind. The doorbell rang. Daniel didn't flinch this time. He straightened his shoulders and went to answer it. 3 people entered the house. 2 men in dark suits and a woman with sharp eyes and a tablet held close to her chest. They looked around as they stepped inside, taking in the high ceilings, the furniture, the quiet hum of the radio. Their gazes moved with practiced efficiency, noting details, assigning meaning. This is my father, Daniel said, gesturing toward Mr. Howard. And this is Annie. Annie felt every eye turn toward her. She stood still, hands clasped in front of her, chin level. Her mother had taught her how to stand when adults looked at her like that. Not proud, not small, just present. This is the child? One of the men asked, not unkindly, but with clear disbelief. Yes, Daniel replied evenly. The woman glanced down at her tablet. 6 years old, she said. That's what the file says. Mr. Howard's jaw tightened. She's a person, he said calmly. Not a file. The woman looked up, surprised, then nodded once. Of course, they took seats around the living room, their movements careful, deliberate. Annie remained standing until Mr. Howard gestured gently to the chair beside him. You may sit, he said. She did. The radio continued to play, its voice threading quietly through the conversation. We're concerned, the first man began. Not about the radio, obviously, but about the decisions that followed. Daniel leaned against the mantel, arms crossed loosely. Concern is fine, he said. Interference is not. The second man frowned. You've redirected company resources, healthcare arrangements, educational support, all without formal approval. Daniel nodded. I acted. You bypassed protocol. Yes, the woman cleared her throat. This sets a precedent. Daniel smiled faintly. So does ignoring reality. Annie didn't understand all the words, but she understood tone. She understood when adults were arguing without raising their voices. Mr. Howard reached out and turned the radio up slightly. The sound filled the pause that followed. I want to say something, he said. All eyes turned to him. I've spent most of my life believing that comfort was something you earned, he continued. That if you worked hard enough, you deserved quiet, distance, insulation from trouble. He glanced at Annie. Then a child ran across my living room floor and reminded me what care actually looks like. The first man shifted in his seat. With respect, sir, this isn't about sentiment. Mr. Howard met his gaze. It's always about sentiment. You just don't like admitting it. Silence fell again. Annie felt her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid, but she felt exposed, like a light had been turned on and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The woman looked at Annie then. "Can you tell us what happened with the radio?" she asked. Annie hesitated, then nodded. "It fell," she said simply. Mr. Howard almost fell too. I helped him sit. The radio stopped making noise. "And then?" the woman prompted. "I picked it up," Annie continued. "A wire was loose. I fixed it." The man beside her raised an eyebrow. "You diagnosed it that quickly?" Annie shrugged. It didn't sound right. Daniel watched their faces closely. "And you've been fixing other things?" the woman asked. "Small things," Annie replied. "A lamp. A clock." "Why?" the first man asked. Annie looked at him, puzzled. "Because they were broken." The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle them more than any explanation could have. Mr. Howard smiled. "You see," he said, "this is what we've forgotten. Not everything that's broken announces itself. Some things just go quiet." Daniel straightened. "This company prides itself on innovation," he said, "on solving problems before they become crises. And yet, we missed this. We missed people." The woman tapped her tablet thoughtfully. "You're proposing a shift." "Yes," Daniel replied. "Not away from growth, toward responsibility." The first man leaned back. "And if the market reacts poorly?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then the market will adjust. Or it won't. But I won't run a company that can't see the cost of its own success." Another silence. Annie felt Mr. Howard's hand rest lightly on her shoulder. It grounded her. Finally, the woman spoke. "We'll need to discuss this further." Daniel nodded. "I expected that." They stood, gathering their things. As they moved toward the door, the woman paused and looked back at Annie. "You did something very important," she said. "Whether you meant to or not." Annie nodded. "Okay." When the door closed behind them, the house exhaled. The radio seemed louder now, as if relieved. Mr. Howard laughed softly. "Well," he said, "that went better than expected." Daniel smiled, but it was tired. "The hard part isn't convincing them," he said. "It's staying the course." Annie stood. "Did I do okay?" she asked quietly. Daniel turned to her. "You did exactly what you always do," he said. "You told the truth." Mr. Howard squeezed her shoulder. "That's more than enough." Outside, the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Annie picked up her bag, ready to leave. As she reached the door, Daniel spoke again. "Annie," he said, "tomorrow, I want you to meet someone else." She looked back, a familiar mix of curiosity and worry in her eyes. "Who?" she asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "Someone who can help make sure this doesn't end here." Annie nodded. The radio played on, and somewhere between resistance and resolve, the future took another step forward. Annie met the new person the next morning in the same living room where everything had started. The radio was on, as always. Mr. Howard sat by the window, hands folded, listening more than watching. Daniel stood near the bookshelf, his posture straight but his shoulders relaxed, as if he had already decided something important and no longer needed to defend it. The doorbell rang once. Daniel opened the door and stepped aside. A woman entered, calm and unhurried. She wore a simple jacket, flat shoes, and carried a thin leather folder under her arm. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled back neatly. She didn't look around the house the way the board members had. She looked at the people in it. "This is Miss Ramirez," Daniel said. "She works with community education programs." Miss Ramirez smiled and crouched slightly so she could look Annie in the eyes. "You must be Annie," she said warmly. "I'm very glad to meet you." Annie nodded. "Nice to meet you." And Miss Ramirez straightened and glanced at the radio. "Is that the one?" she asked. Mr. Howard smiled. "That's the one. I heard it stopped working," Miss Ramirez said. "It did. Mr. Howard replied, until Annie decided it didn't have to. Miss Ramirez turned back to Annie. Would you like to tell me what you fixed? Annie hesitated, then answered honestly. A wire. And a connection that moved. Miss Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. That's usually all it takes. They sat together at the table. Miss Ramirez didn't open her folder right away. Instead, she asked Annie about school, about what she liked to read, about the questions she asked when she couldn't sleep. Annie answered quietly, carefully, but her eyes stayed bright. She listens, Miss Ramirez said finally, looking at Daniel. That's the part people miss. Daniel nodded. That's what Professor Allen said too. Miss Ramirez opened her folder at last. Inside were pamphlets, schedules, handwritten notes. Nothing flashy. There are programs, she said, speaking to Annie's mother as much as to Daniel, that help children like Annie learn without rushing them. After-school workshops, mentors, safe places. She paused, but they only work if the child isn't carrying the weight of the adults. Annie's mother shifted slightly on the couch. She had insisted on being there, despite the fatigue. I don't want her taken away from me, she said quietly. Ms. Ramirez met her gaze. That's not what this is, she said gently. This is about support, not replacement. Daniel added, nothing happens without your say. Annie looked from one adult to another, her stomach tight. What if I don't want to go? She asked softly. Miss Ramirez smiled. Then you don't go. That answer settled something in Annie's chest. Mr. Howard cleared his throat. My wife used to say that children grow best when they're invited, not pushed. Miss Ramirez nodded. She was right. For example, the conversation moved slowly, carefully. They spoke about transportation, about timing, about making sure Annie still had time to be a child, about making sure her mother wasn't left behind. Annie listened more than she spoke. She watched faces. She noticed how Daniel leaned forward when her mother spoke, how Mr. Howard nodded along, hands resting calmly on his knees, how Miss Ramirez waited before responding, never interrupting. This felt different from other adult conversations. No one was rushing. No one was trying to win. When it was over, Miss Ramirez stood and closed her folder. I'll check back next week, she said. No decisions today. Annie nodded, relieved. After she left, the house grew quiet again. The good kind. Daniel exhaled slowly. That went well. Mr. Howard smiled. Because you listened. Daniel glanced at Annie. Because we all did. That afternoon, Annie returned to her work. She dusted, folded, straightened, but her mind kept circling the same thought. Learning more, being helped, not being alone. As she worked, she noticed something new. The radio skipped once, just for a second. She froze. Mr. Howard looked up. Did you hear that? Yes, Annie said. She crossed the room and listened closely. The sound was fine again, steady and clear. Sometimes it does that, Mr. Howard said, a flicker of worry crossing his face. Annie shook her head. Not like that. Ike. She knelt and checked the back panel gently, careful not to disturb anything. The wire was still secure, the connection solid. She stood. It's okay, she said. It just needed to settle. Mr. Howard relaxed. Good. Daniel watched her closely. You didn't panic, he said. Annie looked at him. It didn't need it. He smiled faintly. I wish more people knew the difference. That evening, after Annie left, Daniel sat with his father. Do you ever worry, Daniel asked, that this will all go away? That things will slip back? Mr. Howard looked at the radio. Things always try to slip back, he said. That's why you have to notice when they do. Daniel nodded slowly. Across town, Annie helped her mother prepare dinner. They moved carefully, sharing the work. Did you like the lady today? Her mother asked. Yes, Annie replied. She didn't hurry me. Her mother smiled. That's important. Annie lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again. But this time, the crack didn't look so permanent. It looked like something that could be fixed. She thought about wires and voices, about people who listened, about how a house could change when sound returned. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The resistance did not arrive loudly. It came in emails first, carefully worded, polite, concerned. Daniel read them alone in his office late at night, the glow of the screen reflecting off the window. Phrases repeated themselves in different forms: misalignment, risk exposure, reputational focus. No one mentioned Annie by name. They didn't have to. He closed the laptop and sat back, rubbing his eyes. Downstairs, the radio played. Mr. Howard had fallen asleep in his chair again, the notebook resting on his chest, the pen slipping from his fingers onto the rug. The sound filled the house, gentle and steady, doing what it had always done best, keeping loneliness from growing teeth. Daniel watched his father for a long moment before quietly descending the stairs. He picked up the pen, placed it on the side table, and gently adjusted the blanket over his father's legs. Mr. Howard stirred, but didn't wake. "Good night," Daniel whispered. The next morning, Annie arrived to find the house unusually still. The radio was off. She stopped just inside the doorway, her heart tightening. She listened carefully. No sound, no voice, just the hum of the refrigerator in the distance. Mr. Howard sat at the table, hands folded, eyes down. "Good morning," Annie said cautiously. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning. Is the radio broken?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I just didn't turn it on yet." Annie nodded, but she didn't move. She waited. After a moment, Mr. Howard reached out and turned the knob. The radio crackled, then settled into its familiar voice. The tension in Annie's chest loosened. Daniel entered a few minutes later, phone in hand, jaw tight. "We have a problem," he said, not unkindly, but clearly weighed down. Mr. Howard looked at him. "Tell me." "The board is escalating," Daniel said. "They're threatening to freeze certain initiatives, including the community partnerships." Annie's hands stilled at her sides. Mr. Howard frowned. "Because of us?" Daniel hesitated. "Because of what we represent." Silence settled between them. Annie looked from one to the other. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "No," he said immediately. "Absolutely not." Mr. Howard reached out and placed his hand over Annie's small one. "None of this is your fault," he said firmly. "Sometimes people push back when they're afraid of change." Annie thought about that. "What are they afraid of?" Daniel let out a breath. "Losing control." Annie nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense. The day moved forward, but the house felt unsettled. Annie worked carefully, trying not to disturb anything. She noticed Daniel pacing more, taking calls outside, lowering his voice. By mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang. This time, it wasn't planned. Daniel opened the door to find two men he recognized immediately. Senior board members. No smiles, no small talk. "We need to talk," one of them said. "Then you should have scheduled it," Daniel replied evenly. "We tried," the other said. "You didn't respond." Daniel stepped aside. "Come in." They entered, their eyes already scanning the room. One of them noticed Annie near the hallway. "This is inappropriate," he said quietly to Daniel, having staff present during sensitive discussions. "She's not staff," Daniel replied. "She's family." The man scoffed softly. "She's a child." Mr. Howard stood up then. "And she's the reason this house works again," he said calmly. "Choose your words carefully." The men exchanged a glance. "We're concerned about optics," the first man said. "About narrative drift. You're being painted as distracted, emotional." Daniel crossed his arms. "By whom?" "By people who expect consistency." Daniel smiled faintly. "Consistency in ignoring problems? This isn't the time for philosophy," the man snapped. "No," Mr. Howard said quietly. "This is exactly the time." The radio played on, indifferent to the tension. Annie stood very still, her heart pounding. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. She stepped forward. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Every adult turned toward her. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Annie continued. "I just fixed the radio because Mr. Howard was sad." One of the men frowned. "This isn't about you." Annie shook her head. "It is," she said. "Because if I didn't fix it, you wouldn't be here." Silence fell hard. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not fear. Clarity. That's enough, he said. This meeting is over. You can't just... I can, Daniel interrupted. And I will. The men stared at him, stunned. You're choosing this? One asked. Over the company? Daniel looked at Annie, at his father, at the radio that had brought a house back to life. I'm choosing responsibility, he said. If the company can't survive that, then maybe it deserves to change. They left without another word. When the door closed, the house seemed to exhale again. Annie's legs felt weak. She sat down hard on the chair. Mr. Howard knelt in front of her. You were very brave, he said gently. I didn't mean to be, Annie replied. I just told the truth. Daniel crouched beside her. That's the bravest kind. He stood and looked around the room, at the quiet, at the radio, at the small girl who had somehow become the center of a much larger fight. This isn't over, he said to his father. Mr. Howard nodded. No, but it's clearer now. That evening, Annie walked home with her tool bag heavier than usual, not because of the tools, because of the weight of knowing that sometimes fixing something small forces the world to reveal what it's been avoiding. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. The radio wasn't the only thing that had been turned back on. The morning after the board members left, the house felt watched. Not by people, by consequences. Daniel woke before sunrise, dressed without turning on the lights, and stood for a long time in the kitchen staring at nothing. The emails had already begun. Subject lines marked urgent, requests for clarification, invitations to reset the conversation. He ignored them. Down the hall, the radio was silent. That was intentional. Mr. Howard sat in the living room, hands folded, eyes closed, listening to the quiet instead of filling it. He knew this kind of silence. It was the pause before a storm, the moment when the air decided whether to break or pass. Annie arrived just after 8. She stopped in the doorway when she noticed the radio was off again. Her chest tightened, but she didn't say anything. She placed her bag down carefully and waited. Mr. Howard opened his eyes and smiled at her. Good morning. And, good morning, Annie replied. You notice everything, he said gently. She nodded. It's too quiet. He reached for the radio and turned the knob. The familiar crackle filled the room, followed by the steady voice Annie now recognized as safety. The tension eased from her shoulders without her realizing it. Daniel entered a few minutes later. Morning, he said. Morning, his father replied. Daniel looked tired, but not uncertain. There was a difference Annie had learned to recognize. Tired meant something had been spent. Uncertain meant something was being avoided. I made a decision last night, Daniel said, sitting across from his father. Mr. Howard didn't ask what it was. He waited. I'm stepping down as interim chair, Daniel continued. Not resigning. Repositioning. Annie didn't know what those words meant, but she knew they were heavy. Mr. Howard raised an eyebrow. That will upset them. Will ever tend. Yes, Daniel said. Which tells me it's the right move. He turned to Annie. This doesn't change anything for you. Or your mother. Annie nodded slowly. Okay. Daniel hesitated, then added, Actually, it changes something. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling out a thin folder. He placed it on the table but didn't open it yet. I'm creating a foundation, he said, quietly, independent from the board. Focused on families like yours. Healthcare access. Education support. Mr. Howard studied him carefully. And this foundation answers to whom? Daniel met his gaze. To the people it serves. Annie looked at the folder. Do I have to do anything? She asked. Daniel smiled faintly. No, you already did. Mr. Howard leaned back, exhaling. Your mother would be proud. Daniel swallowed. I hope so. Later that morning, Miss Ramirez returned. She listened as Daniel explained the decision, her expression thoughtful. They'll fight this, she said. I know, Daniel replied. Quiet foundations still make noise, she said. Just not the kind people expect. That's the point. Miss Ramirez turned to Annie. How do you feel about all this? Annie thought for a long moment. I don't want anyone to be mad because of me. Miss Ramirez crouched to her level. People aren't mad because of you, she said gently. They're mad because you showed them something they didn't want to see. Annie frowned. What? That they missed something important. Annie considered that. Then she nodded, as if it fit into a place she'd been keeping open. That afternoon, Daniel received the call he'd been expecting. He took it in the study, door closed. The board's voice was calm, controlled, disappointed. This path will cost you, they said. I know, Daniel replied. You're risking credibility. I'm choosing it. You're aligning yourself with sentiment. Daniel glanced at the radio through the open doorway, where his father sat listening, alive in a way he hadn't been for years. I'm aligning myself with consequence, Daniel said. Those are different things. When the call ended, Daniel didn't feel relief. He felt settled. That evening, Annie helped Mr. Howard prepare dinner. He moved slowly but with purpose, narrating small tasks the way people did when they were no longer afraid of the quiet. You know, he said, I spent most of my life believing that dignity came from position. Annie stirred the pot carefully. Where does it come from now? He smiled. From showing up. Daniel watched them from the doorway, something tightening in his chest. Later, as Annie prepared to leave, Daniel walked her to the door. Your mother starts the next phase of treatment tomorrow, he said. Annie nodded. She's scared. So am I, Daniel admitted, but not of the same things. We'll gauze. Annie looked up at him. You're not going to stop, are you? No, he said. Even if it costs me. She thought about that, then said, sometimes fixing something means you can't put it back the way it was. Daniel smiled. You taught me that. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room. The radio played softly. He thought about power, about silence, about the difference between charity and responsibility. And for the first time in years, he didn't wonder what the market would think tomorrow. He wondered who would be helped. That felt like progress. The hospital room was brighter than Annie expected. Sunlight poured in through a wide window, warming the pale walls and turning the white sheets almost golden. Machines hummed softly, not in warning, but in rhythm. Annie stood beside the bed, holding her mother's hand, feeling the thin pulse beneath her fingers. You don't have to stay the whole time, her mother said gently. I'll be all right. I want to, Annie replied. The nurse smiled at them both. She can stay, she said. She's been very good company today. Annie's mother laughed quietly. She always is. The treatment took time. There were pauses, explanations, moments when Annie's mother closed her eyes and breathed through discomfort. Annie stayed still, focused, the way she was when fixing something delicate. She watched the nurse's hands. She listened to the sounds the machines made, filing them away in her mind. When it was over, her mother looked tired, but different, not weaker, lighter. It doesn't feel like the end of the world anymore, her mother whispered. Annie nodded. I told you. Outside the room, Daniel waited. He stood when they approached, his expression careful, respectful, as if this moment belonged to them and he was only allowed to witness it. How did it go? He asked. Her mother met his eyes. They treated me like I mattered, she said. That's more than medicine. Daniel nodded. It should never have been rare. Okay. On the drive back, Annie leaned her head against the window, exhaustion settling in. She watched the city pass, the rhythm of traffic steady and ordinary. Ordinary felt good. At the house, Mr. Howard was waiting. He rose slowly when they entered, his face brightening when he saw Annie's mother standing a little straighter than before. You look well, he said. I feel hopeful, she replied. He smiled. That's even better. We've see. They sat together in the living room, the radio playing softly in the background. The familiar voice filled the space without demanding attention, a presence rather than a performance. I was thinking, Mr. Howard said after a while, about the word justice. Daniel looked up. In what way? People think it's loud, Mr. Howard continued, that it comes with speeches and punishments and headlines. He glanced at Annie. But sometimes, justice is quiet. It looks like a child fixing a radio, or a doctor listening, or someone choosing not to look away. Annie listened carefully. Her mother squeezed her hand. Justice isn't always fair, she said softly, but it can be kind. Daniel felt something settle in his chest at that. Not relief, resolve. That afternoon, Miss Ramirez returned with papers tucked under her arm. Not contracts, plans. The foundation is registered, she said to Daniel. Small. Clean. No press. Good, Daniel replied. It won't stay invisible forever, she warned. I don't want it to, he said. I just want it to be honest first. Miss Ramirez nodded. Then you're starting it the right way. She turned to Annie's mother. There are other families, she said. People who don't know where to go yet. Her mother considered this. If it helps them the way it helped us, she said. Then yes. Annie looked between them. Do I have to talk to people? She asked. Miss Ramirez smiled. Only if you want to. Oh, Annie thought for a moment. I'd rather fix things. Daniel smiled. There will be plenty of those. That evening, the house felt full. Not crowded, full. Mr. Howard insisted on cooking. It took longer than usual, but no one rushed him. Annie handed him ingredients one by one. Her mother sat at the table, resting but present. Daniel set the plates without being asked. They ate together as the sun dipped low, the radio playing softly through dinner. No one talked much. They didn't need to. Afterward, as Annie prepared to leave, Mr. Howard stopped her. Come here, he said. He reached into the drawer beside his chair and pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. He placed it in Annie's hands. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a single brass knob from the radio, old, smooth from years of use. This was replaced once, he said, years ago. Your hands fix the inside. I thought you should have something that remembers the outside. Annie held it carefully, reverent. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel walked her to the door. You don't owe us anything, he said. Annie looked up at him. I know. She stepped outside into the cooling evening, the knob warm in her pocket. Back inside, Daniel sat with his father, the house quiet again but alive. You're changing more than you realize, Mr. Howard said. Daniel shook his head. I'm just not running anymore, Mr. Howard smiled. That's change enough. I-15. Later, alone in the living room, Daniel turned the radio down just slightly and closed his eyes. He thought about the cost of his decisions, the pushback that would come, the things he might lose. Then he thought about what had been gained. Sometimes, he realized, justice didn't arrive like a verdict. It arrived like sound returning to a room that had forgotten how to listen. The foundation did not announce itself. There were no press releases, no ribbon cuttings, no carefully staged photographs. It began the way most meaningful things did, quietly, with paperwork and phone calls, with meetings held in borrowed rooms and conversations that lasted longer than planned. Annie didn't attend those meetings. She went to school. That alone felt like a change. Her mornings no longer began with worry about whether her mother could stand up that day. Treatment had not cured everything, but it had given her mother's strength back in pieces. Enough to cook some days. Enough to walk Annie to the bus stop once a week. Enough to smile without forcing it. Annie noticed everything. At the resort house, Mr. Howard noticed too. He listened to the radio every morning as usual, but now he wrote afterward. Longhand. Slow. He filled pages with memories he had avoided for years, his wife laughing at a joke the radio host told, the way she used to hum while folding laundry. The afternoons, when silence hadn't yet learned how to linger. One morning, Annie found him staring at a blank page. It's not coming today, he said gently. That's okay, Annie replied. It will later, he smiled. You sound very sure. She shrugged. Things don't disappear. They wait. Recons. Daniel heard that from the hallway and stopped walking. He had reduced his travel to almost nothing now. The board had not stopped pushing, but something had shifted. Every time they threatened, Daniel asked a question instead of giving an answer. Every time they demanded certainty, he spoke about consequence. Some resigned, others stayed. Those who stayed listened. One afternoon, Daniel returned home carrying a stack of folders. He set them on the dining table and rubbed his neck. Long day, Mr. Howard said. Daniel nodded. We funded 3 clinics. Mr. Howard looked up sharply. Already? Yes, Daniel replied. Quietly, they needed it. Annie paused in the doorway. People get help now? Yes, Daniel said. Because of you, she frowned. I didn't do that. Daniel met her eyes. You reminded us to. Annie considered that. Then she nodded, accepting it the way she accepted most things, not as praise, but as fact. That evening, Miss Ramirez stopped by. The first reports are in, she said, handing Daniel a slim folder. They're small victories, but they're real. Daniel opened it slowly. Stories, names, situations that sounded too familiar. Mr. Howard leaned over his shoulder. This one, he said, pointing. She reminds me of my wife. Miss Ramirez smiled softly. Most of them remind me of someone. Annie sat on the floor nearby, sorting through a box of old electronics Mr. Howard had asked her to look at. A clock radio that didn't keep time. A lamp with a frayed cord. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. She fixed the clock first. As she worked, she listened to the adults talk. There's backlash, Miss Ramirez said. People are asking questions. Let them, Daniel replied. We're not hiding. But you're not performing either, she added. No, he said. We're working. That night, Daniel stood alone on the patio, the city lights distant and small. He thought about the man he had been a year ago. The one who measured success by speed and distance, by how quickly he could move on to the next thing. Now, he found himself staying. Inside, the radio played. Mr. Howard slept in his chair again, notebook resting on his chest. The page finally filled. Annie sat nearby, her homework spread out neatly, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Daniel watched them through the glass. He realized then that the board had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't distraction. It was alignment. A few days later, Annie's teacher called her mother. Not with concern, with curiosity. She asks unusual questions, the teacher said. About how things work, about why systems fail. Annie's mother smiled when she told her, that sounds like you. Annie shrugged. Things break when people stop listening. Her mother nodded slowly. You should keep saying that. Two made it. At the house, Mr. Howard received a letter. He opened it carefully, hands steady. It's from the station, he said, holding it up. The radio station. Daniel looked up. What do they want? They're retiring the morning host, Mr. Howard said. After 40 years. Annie looked up from her book. Is he sad? Mr. Howard smiled. I think he's ready. They listened together that morning, the voice familiar, warm, a little slower than usual. When the host signed off, Mr. Howard wiped his eyes. Endings don't have to be cruel, he said. No, Annie replied. They just make space. That afternoon, Daniel received another call from the board. This one was different. They wanted to talk, not threaten, not posture. Talk, he agreed. After the call, he sat down heavily. Mr. Howard studied him. How did it feel? Daniel exhaled. Like they finally heard the radio. Mr. Howard chuckled. Took them long enough. Annie smiled at that. The foundation's work continued. Slowly. Intentionally. Without spectacle. And one evening, as Annie prepared to leave, Daniel stopped her. Annie, he said, there are people who want to meet you. Her shoulders tensed. Why? Because they think you're extraordinary, he replied. She frowned. I'm just careful. Daniel smiled. That's rarer than you think. Mr. Howard stood. You don't owe anyone a performance, he said. Not now. Not ever. Annie nodded gratefully. As she walked home that night, the city felt different. Not kinder. Not easier, but more possible. She held the brass radio knob in her pocket, rubbing her thumb over its smooth surface. Somewhere, a radio played. Somewhere, someone listened. And the work, quiet, steady, unseen, continued. The invitation arrived, folded, not sealed. Daniel left it on the kitchen table one morning, weighted down by the brass radio knob so it wouldn't curl at the edges. Annie noticed it immediately. She always did. She didn't touch it. What's that? She asked. Daniel glanced at the paper, then at her. A request, he said. Not a demand. Mr. Howard adjusted his glasses. From whom? From the station, Daniel replied. They're doing a final live broadcast for the retiring host. They want to acknowledge the listeners who kept him company all these years. Annie looked at the radio. It played softly, as if it had heard its name. They want Annie to come, Daniel added. Not to speak, just to be there. Annie's shoulders tensed. Why me? Mr. Howard smiled gently. Because sometimes people want to thank the quiet ones. Annie thought about that. Quiet was something she understood. Loud felt dangerous. Loud came with expectations. I don't want to be on the radio, she said carefully. Daniel nodded. You won't be. Silence settled. After a moment, Annie asked, will Mr. Howard go? Mr. Howard looked surprised. If you want me to, she nodded once. Okay. The station building was smaller than Annie imagined. No marble floors, no shining walls, just old brick, worn steps, and a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. The kind of place that had been used, not admired. The host greeted them himself. He was older than his voice suggested, his smile slow and genuine. You must be Annie, he said, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. I hear you fix things. Annie nodded. Sometimes. He chuckled. So do I, he said. With words, they led them into the studio. Annie stared at the microphones, the dials, the wires that ran everywhere. She recognized some of them. Not all, but enough to feel calm instead of afraid. The host spoke into the microphone as if speaking to one person, not thousands. He thanked listeners, told small stories, laughed softly at memories that didn't need explanation. Then he paused. There's someone here today, he said, who reminded us that sound isn't just something we hear. It's something we keep. He didn't say her name. He didn't point. He just let the words sit. Annie stood beside Mr. Howard, holding his hand. His grip tightened slightly, not from fear, but from feeling something come full circle. When the broadcast ended, the host turned off the mic and exhaled. That's that, he said. 40 years. Annie looked at him. Are you sad? He smiled. No. I'm finished. She nodded. That made sense. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warm, forgiving. Daniel watched Annie carefully as they walked back to the car. You okay? He asked. Yes, she replied. They didn't make me talk. Mr. Howard laughed softly. You said plenty without speaking. On the drive home, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then turned it face down. What is it? Mr. Howard asked. Daniel smiled, tired but steady. They're voting. On what? Annie asked. On whether to stop fighting me, Daniel replied. She considered that. Are they scared? Yes. Then maybe they're listening, she said. Daniel met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Back at the house, the radio played as usual. Mr. Howard sat down and reached for his notebook. He wrote a single line, then closed it. That's the last page, he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. No more writing? Mr. Howard shook his head. Not like that. I don't need to remember anymore. I'm here, Annie smiled. That evening, Miss Ramirez called. They approved it, she said, unanimously. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Thank you. They didn't say why, she added. Daniel looked at Annie, who was carefully rewrapping the brass knob in its cloth. I know why, he said. After the call, Daniel sat quietly. I thought justice would feel louder, he admitted. Like winning. Mr. Howard shook his head. Justice doesn't need an audience, he said. It needs continuity. Annie nodded, like a radio signal. Daniel laughed softly. Exactly. As the night settled, Annie prepared to leave. Mr. Howard walked her to the door, slower than before. But sure. You did good work, he said. Annie shook her head. I just didn't stop. He smiled. That's the work. She stepped outside, the evening cool and calm. The city hummed quietly, alive in its own way. Inside, the radio played. Inside, things were no longer broken. The radio played softer these days. Not because it was failing, because it no longer had to fight the silence. Annie noticed it on a quiet Sunday morning as she sat on the living room rug, legs crossed, working carefully on an old flashlight Mr. Howard had found in a drawer. The sound was steady, calm, like breathing. The house no longer leaned toward it for comfort. It simply lived with it. Mr. Howard sat by the window, sunlight warming his shoulders. He wasn't writing anymore. He wasn't trying to hold on to the past. He just listened. Daniel stood in the doorway, coffee untouched in his hand, watching them both. It had been 6 months since the radio fell. 6 months since a small pair of hands had refused to walk past something broken. The foundation had grown quietly. Clinics stayed open. Families received help without having to beg. Teachers called Miss Ramirez instead of giving up. No banners. No speeches. Just systems that worked because someone bothered to care whether they did. Daniel still faced resistance, but it no longer scared him. He had learned the difference between power and noise. Annie's mother arrived that morning on her own. She walked slowly, but she walked. No cane, no borrowed strength. Just herself, steady and present. When she entered the house, Mr. Howard stood to greet her, his movements careful but proud. "You look well," he said. "I feel like myself again," she replied. They sat together, the four of them, the radio filling the space without demanding it. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Annie finished with the flashlight. She clicked it on. It worked. She smiled, just a little. Daniel watched her and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Gratitude, awe, responsibility. He knew now that this feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't supposed to. "Annie," he said gently, "there's something I want to show you." "Ever?" She looked up, wary but curious. They stepped outside to the small workshop that had once gone unused. Inside, the shelves were clean. Tools hung neatly on the wall. On the workbench sat radios, clocks, lamps, things people had thrown away because fixing them took too much time. Annie stepped inside slowly. "This is for you," Daniel said. "Not just you, but you." She ran her fingers over the workbench, her eyes wide. "I don't have to fix everything," she said carefully. "No," Daniel replied. "You get to choose." She nodded, satisfied. Mr. Howard watched from the doorway, his eyes shining. He thought of his wife, of how she used to say that love wasn't loud. It was consistent. He felt her absence, but not the ache anymore. Just the shape she had left behind, filled with meaning. That afternoon, Annie returned home with her mother. They cooked together, slowly, laughing when something burned, talking about school, about buses, about the strange feeling of being able to plan past next week. Annie placed the brass radio knob on the shelf beside her bed when she went to sleep that night. It no longer felt like a reminder of pain. It felt like proof. Weeks passed, then months. Annie grew, not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily. She learned new words, new questions, new ways of listening. She still fixed things, but she also learned when to stop, when to ask for help, when something didn't need fixing at all. Daniel continued to choose differently. The board stopped fighting him. Some left, others followed. The company changed its language first, then its practices. No one called it revolutionary. They called it sustainable. Mr. Howard grew older, but not lonelier. On his birthday, Annie gave him a small gift wrapped in newspaper. Inside was the flashlight she had fixed, polished and steady. "So you can see," she said. He hugged her, longer than necessary. Years later, when Annie was asked quietly, politely how everything began, she would think for a moment before answering. "With a radio," she would say. "With a man who was lonely. With people who stopped pretending they didn't hear the silence." The radio never stopped working again. But even if it had, it wouldn't have mattered as much, because the lesson it carried had already been heard. Kindness was not weakness. Justice was not loud. And sometimes, when something falls and breaks, it isn't the end. It's an invitation. And Annie had answered it. The story reminds us that true justice and kindness are often quiet acts, not loud gestures or public victories. A small choice made with compassion can restore dignity, heal unseen wounds, and ripple outward in ways no one expects. Power does not come from control or status, but from the willingness to notice what others ignore and to act when something is broken, even if no one is watching. In a world that often rewards speed, profit, and indifference, the story asks us to remember that listening, caring, and doing the right thing, especially for the vulnerable, are the forces that truly change lives. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.